flight attendant removed her stockings in front of all passengers. She did this because the aircraft's landing gear had malfunctioned, forcing an emergency landing. Removing the stockings was to prevent skin burns in case of fire. Additionally, all sharp objects including earrings and jewelry had to be removed. At this moment, the aircraft only had enough fuel for about 10 more minutes of flight. The ground fire department had just arrived at the airport runway. Even if they sprayed foam at maximum speed, it would be nearly impossible to cover the entire 5-kilometer runway in just 10 minutes. The fire chief immediately decided to spray foam only in the most critical areas. Meanwhile, hundreds of armed police officers and medical personnel had all rushed to the scene. When passengers learned of the emergency landing, everyone became frightened. Some people screamed hysterically on the plane, while others wrote what they believed would be their final letters. This was a real incident that occurred on September 10, 1998. An MD-11 passenger aircraft flying from Shanghai Hongqiao to Beijing, carrying 137 passengers, took off normally as usual. However, shortly after takeoff, the captain inadvertently noticed that the nose landing gear warning light, which should have been off, remained illuminated. He asked technical personnel to check whether the aircraft had any malfunctions. After inspection, they discovered that the aircraft's nose landing gear could not be lowered, which meant the plane could not land normally. Realizing the severity of the situation, the captain immediately sent a distress call to ground control. The tower quickly received the message, cleared the runway, and requested the aircraft to return immediately. Ground personnel also observed that the aircraft's landing gear could not open normally, meaning that even returning would not allow for a normal landing. After discussion, the command center decided to have the aircraft descend from altitude and rapidly climb when 30 meters from the ground. This would create a counterforce that might shake the landing gear loose. As the altitude gradually dropped to the predetermined height, the captain pulled hard on the control stick. The altitude instantly soared to several thousand meters. The massive turbulence caused passenger panic, but after completing this maneuver, that deadly red light remained on. Ground control then provided a new solution. Make sharp turns at 300 knots to shake the landing gear loose. The severe turbulence caused passengers to vomit. But even so, the button in the cockpit still did not reset. The ground command team realized the severity of the problem. Armed police units, fire trucks, and ambulance teams were all deployed, preparing for the worst-case scenario. The commander had one last option: have the aircraft land tail first. At the moment the rear landing gear touched the ground, it would climb rapidly again. This would use vibration and counterforce to force the landing gear down. The captain called the chief flight attendant and asked her to do everything possible to calm passengers and move all passengers to the rear cabin. If this operation failed, sparks would fly the moment the nose gear touched the ground, and the cockpit and front cabin would be the first areas to receive impact. When passengers heard they needed to relocate, they immediately panicked and rushed toward the rear cabin. Flight attendants came to the rear cabin to teach passengers the crash position. Spread legs apart, cross arms, and bury the head between the arms. This would minimize impact damage. The aircraft's altitude had dropped to 300 meters and was about to make contact with the ground. Despite all these operations, the red light still had not gone out. The aircraft's fuel was nearly depleted, with less than 30 minutes of flight time remaining. Ground command suggested the captain open the cabin door to try manually lowering the landing gear. However, this was extremely dangerous. One wrong move, and someone could be blown away by the wind. The captain lowered the aircraft to 450 meters to minimize air pressure. The co-pilot then opened the cabin door. The cold sweat on his face was instantly blown away. Enduring suffocating pain, he climbed down the aircraft and repeatedly struck the landing gear with a hammer. He discovered that the landing gear's lockbox was broken, meaning the landing gear could not be restored. Now only one option remained: emergency landing. The ground command center discussed new plans again. Although emergency landing wasn't highly dangerous, there were very few successful emergency landing cases worldwide. Success depended entirely on which part of the aircraft touched down first. If the nose touched down first, it would create massive sparks from ground friction, potentially detonating the fuel tank and engines. The wreckage would rush off the runway toward the terminal building. Another option was grassfield landing. But since the aircraft lacked sufficient power to provide necessary braking, the grass's massive friction would snap the aircraft in half, resulting in total destruction and loss of life. Finally, the commander decided on runway emergency landing. Fire retardant foam needed to be sprayed on the runway to minimize the possibility of aircraft fire. However, existing fire trucks were insufficient. Even with reserve fuel, only 40 minutes remained. All fire trucks deployed could spray at most 300 meters, far short of the expected 1 kilometer. Command decided to spray foam only on both sides of the runway, and if time permitted, continue spraying in the middle, minimizing fire risk under limited conditions. The chief flight attendant required passengers to remove all sharp objects, including shoes and stockings. In the cockpit, 3 crew members looked at each other tensely. They pressed their fists together tightly. The aircraft prepared to descend. Ground command immediately cleared the runway. Several hundred meters of foam had been laid, and fire trucks and ambulances were standing by around the runway. The aircraft began its emergency landing. All cabin lights went out. Flight attendants shouted crash position commands. The captain desperately pulled the control stick to reduce flight speed to minimum. The rear landing gear successfully touched down. The aircraft slid continuously on the fire retardant foam.